This is the podcast overview for Chapter 2, Biological Psychology, where we will be covering all the key things that you need to be thinking about and focusing in on as you're reading through this chapter. Now, for some of you, you've had a little bit of this in science classes, or you maybe took psychology in high school, and so you may be familiar with some of this terminology, maybe not. Some of you, this is the first time you're hearing about the brain and behavior and all of that. So it's a packed chapter. I just want to start off by prefacing with that. Lots of terminology, lots of definitions. This is definitely one of those chapters where making note cards for the various definitions would be helpful, and reviewing those note cards kind of over and over, taking them where you go with you in your car, wherever you are, because it's just going to help familiarize you with terminology that isn't used every day. So a lot of these terms are things you're not going to hear about in day-to-day life and interactions. So the beginning of the chapter starts by using the base principle of neurons. Okay, everything happens at a neural level. For us to do anything, to blink an eye, to raise an arm, to say a word, to fall asleep, all of these things happen because neurons in our body talk to each other, and they tell tell another part of the body to do something. They send those messages. So first thing is we got to understand what a neuron is, and describe its functions, understand the anatomy of a neuron, and then once we know that, we can then talk about how neurons communicate. And this starts with the action potential, which is where all the action happens. It's how a message begins at the neural level. And it happens with neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters are those elements responsible for transmitting messages from neuron to neuron so that you can lift your arm or raise your voice. And so they communicate with each other in the body. This happens in the brain and in the spinal cord. So we're going to talk about what are the components of the brain and the spinal cord, some misconceptions about the brain, neuroplasticity, which is basically that your brain is very fluid and changeable. What happens in the brain is not set in stone. You can learn new things all the time. You can make mistakes, you can grow. Every time you do something different, you're developing new connections, neural connections in the brain. And this is why people who have brain injuries can recover and get better and learn to walk again, learn to tie shoes again, learn to speak again, because the brain is that amazing. And this all has to do with how it communicates with the body. We're going to be further looking at the somatic and autonomic nervous systems. These are branches within the nervous system. They just are responsible for different things. The autonomic nervous system is responsible for a lot of automatic body processes. And so it will further break down into those that are excitatory and those that are inhibitory. And the somatic is all the muscles and brain functioning that is also happening simultaneously with your autonomic nervous system. We'll be looking at hormones. What is their role? Hormones are the chemical messengers. They're released by the glands, and they're what helps neurotransmitters to communicate messages between bodily systems so that what your immune system's doing can communicate with what your nervous system's doing or your cardiovascular system is doing. And so it's going to talk about how your behavior is affected when these systems interact with one another. You'll learn about the breakdown of the autonomic nervous system into the parasympathetic and sympathetic branches and how those are impacted particularly by stress. We'll take a look at some lesioning studies and brain studies that these are the methods we use to study the brain that help us understand why the brain does what it does and how it does what it does. So we scratch the surface here, okay? If you're interested in this stuff, if this fascinates you, I would highly recommend taking physiological psych or cognitive psych, where we get much more into detail in the brain. This intro psych class scratches the surface here with this chapter. So additionally, we'll also be looking at different techniques that can be used to study the brain. Lots of different neuroimaging techniques. As technology advances, we're able to research the brain in more sophisticated ways to understand its structure and how each thing functions within the brain. This is how we develop medicines for things like Alzheimer's. As we understand memory more and more, we can start to manipulate memory, right? And come up with drugs and treatments that further advance this field. The latter part of this chapter will focus on parts of the brain. So once we move past the neural level, neurons and how the nervous system communicates, that's one whole big area. Then we'll look at the brain and how you have different lobes of the brain, how the brain cortex, the wrinkly kind of outside that we all see when we see the brain, how that functions, and how we have specific regions on that cortex that are primary for different types of functions. So like emotions, learning, memory, motivation, there's different spots specific to those things on the brain. Okay, so one area of the brain is involved in controlling emotions. Another area of the brain is what's most activated when you're learning something new, and so forth. Okay, we'll learn how the cortex uses all our different senses and movement of the body to process information, and then areas of the cortex that are responsible for more higher order thinking, complex thought, analytical reasoning, language development, understanding, and all of that. We also, our brains are further divided into hemispheres. You have a left and a right hemisphere of the brain. They do function a little differently. They're thought to house different areas that are more site specific. And so you'll learn kind of what this is where the saying left brain and right brain comes from. You'll learn kind of what the left side of the brain is more responsible for and what the right side of the brain is more responsible for. I mean, the brain as a whole does many things, but it's like a mechanic in that, it masterminds everything, and it has a compartment for everything, and it all kind of fits together just so. And then the latter part, very end of the chapter, we'll talk about some different disorders, specifically ADHD, and how that's related to the brain. These are more interest-based. A lot of times students who take intro psych, they've heard things about how a person learns or how a person understands, how they take in information, and they might have heard it in the context of a mental disorder or an illness or something of that manner. And this is fascinating. This is what draws us to psychology. Oh, I want to know more about that. I have trouble focusing. I have trouble, sitting still. What does that mean? What is my brain doing? And this is where it can be kind of cool, because we start to put definitions and concepts into play to understand that which we sometimes interact with a lot on a daily basis, but might not understand very well. So I hope that gives you a good overview of the chapter. Again, as you're working through the material this week, if you get stuck on any one of these areas, please feel free to reach out to me. I'd be glad to further explain anything to you, whether that be talking to you or Zooming or a little podcast or whatever that might look like. But please reach out if you're having trouble understanding the readings. I also want to just emphasize, please watch not only the videos that I post in this week's material, but also the videos that are on Revel with chapter 2. It'll stop you, as you're reading, it'll have like a video for you to watch. Those are all really important, especially in this chapter, because they go over visually concepts that are hard to explain in words, but when you see it in pictures, it makes sense, especially the neuron and the parts of the brain. Understanding how that all operates, it's a very visual phenomenon. So very essential for you to be watching the videos this week. Okay, let me know if you have any questions as you go through the material. Thanks, everyone.